Hi, thanks for joining me. I'm Mindy Mandell, and today we're going to take a second look at the dialogue Phaedo. I did talk about Phaedo last week, and I'll leave a link for that for those of you who missed that video. Last week, we looked at what the dialogue is about, and this takes place on the last day of Socrates' life. He's having a final conversation with his friends, and he explains to them why he does not fear death and why he thinks that the soul is immortal. So that was covered a bit last week. Today, what we're going to look at are some of the doubts that his friends had. So they listened to him, they followed him logically, and they said, okay, yeah, we agree with you. It does seem like the soul is immortal, but we still have some doubts. And so Socrates addressed their doubts, and that's what I'm going to focus on today. So we're looking today at the immortality of the soul and addressing the various doubts to it. So here is the first doubt, and it's explained by a man named Cebes. He says, after hearing Socrates' explanations about the nature of the soul, he says, men find it very hard to believe what you said about the soul. They think that after it had left the body, it no longer exists anywhere, but that it is destroyed and dissolved on the day the man dies, as soon as it leaves the body, and that on leaving it, it is dispersed like breath or smoke. It has flown away and gone and is no longer anything anywhere. And by the way, before I go on, all of our translations, as with last week, are from the translator George's Groot. Okay, so Socrates has to address this idea that when we die, the soul just dissipates like smoke. And Cebes also expresses this point here, that his doubt is that the soul still exists after a man has died, and that it still possesses some capability and intelligence. So I'm adding this point because Socrates is going to address this point as well. There are two things then that Socrates has to talk about here. That the soul does exist after we die, and also that it possesses some sort of capability and intelligence. To address this, he's going to discuss this idea of opposites. And he brought this up in the introduction. I talked about this a bit last week. There's a play throughout this dialogue of the relationship between mythos and logos. That logos opens up mythos. So either the mythos is correct, but it needs to be explained, and so the logos opens it up and explains it, or perhaps there's even some misunderstanding in there, and the logos can help us see the error. So throughout the dialogue, Socrates is opening up the logos of various mythos. So last week we saw in the introduction that Socrates gave a sort of makeshift myth or fable about the relationship of opposites, how they follow one another. What we're going to see him do here now is open up the logos of this relationship by explaining to us what he sees as the true relationship of opposites. He says, let us examine whether those that have an opposite must necessarily come to be from their opposite and from nowhere else. As, for example, when something comes to be larger, it must necessarily become larger from having been smaller before. And he gives a number of other examples. Here we see weaker comes from the stronger, the swifter from the slower. And then he says there's a further point, something such as this about these opposites. Between each of these pairs of opposites, there are two processes. So between the larger and the smaller, there is increase and decrease, and we call the one increasing and the other decreasing. And then after giving some various examples, he comes around to our topic. He says, well then, is there an opposite to living, as sleeping is the opposite of being awake? Quite so. What is it? Being dead. Therefore, if these are opposites, they come to be from one another, and there are two processes of generation between the two. And so he says it's agreed between us then that the living come from the dead in this way no less than the dead from the living. And if that is so, it seems to be a sufficient proof that the souls of the dead must be somewhere whence they can come back again. Now, I think our knee-jerk reaction to this theory the first time we hear it is that it's just wordplay. And so we have to sit with it and think about it and see if there's anything more to it than that. So what he's saying here, of course, is that the dead must come from the living and the living must come from the dead. If this were not so, then it would be something against nature because this relationship exists throughout. He says, furthermore, Eusebius then brings in the idea of recollection. He ties that theory in. He says, furthermore, Socrates, such is also the case, if that theory is true that you're accustomed to mention frequently, that for us learning is no other than recollection. According to this, we must at some previous time have learned what we now recollect. This is possible only if our soul existed somewhere before it took on this human shape. Well, the theory of recollection was discussed in the dialogue Meno, and so I talked about that a few weeks ago, but there is a bit more on it here. So let's take a look at how Socrates talks about it here in the Phaedo. And he starts with the example of the equal itself. Consider whether this is the case. We say that there is something that is equal. I do not mean a stick equal to a stick, or a stone to a stone, or anything of that kind, but something else beyond all these, the equal itself. Whence have we acquired the knowledge of it? Is it not from the things we mentioned just now, from seeing sticks and stones and some other things that are equal? We come to think of that other which is different from them. So the equal itself is different from equal things, but yet the equal things that we see on earth, they open in us a memory of the equal itself. He says we then must possess knowledge of the equal before that time when we first saw the equal objects, and realize that all these objects strive to be like the equal, but are deficient in this. So in order to recognize that two things look equal or are almost equal, we have to know equality itself in order to make that judgment. So then Simmias jumped into the conversation at some point here. So then Simmias, our souls also existed apart from the body before they took on human form, and they had intelligence. Remember, Socrates had to show those two things. And by tying in the theory of forms along with the theory of opposites, he shows both. Simmias, though, has an objection. He says, unless we acquire the knowledge at the moment of birth, for that time is still left to us. And Socrates says, quite so, my friend. But at what other time do we lose it? We just now agreed that we are not born with that knowledge. Do we then lose it at the very time we acquire it? Or can you mention any other time? I cannot, Socrates. I did not realize that I was talking nonsense. Okay, Simmias, though, has a further objection. He says, I do not think myself, however, that it has been proved that the soul continues to exist after death. What is to prevent the soul coming to be and being constituted from some other source, existing before it enters a human body, and then, having done so and departed from it, itself dying and being destroyed? Well, then Socrates reminds him that it actually has been proven. If you're ready to combine this argument with the one we agreed on before, that every living thing must come from the dead. So again, if you put together those two theories, the theory of opposites and the theory of recollection, it proves Socrates' point. But Socrates says, you know what, I think there's actually something else going on. You seem to have this childish fear that the wind would really dissolve and scatter the soul as it leaves the body, especially if one happens to die in a high wind and not in calm weather. So Socrates makes a little joke here, and they all have a nice little laugh at it. And then his friends say, yeah, actually, we do have that fear. And so Socrates addresses that fear in this way. We must then ask ourselves something like this. What kind of thing is likely to be scattered? On behalf of what kind of thing should one fear this? And for what kind of thing should one not fear it? We should then examine to which class the soul belongs, and as a result, either fear for the soul or be of good cheer. So the next part of the discussion we can summarize with this little chart here. So the things that disperse are composites. They're things that are inconstant and variable in time and space. Things that don't disperse are partless. They're constant and they are invariable. Now next they talk about where do things in themselves belong. And they decide that things that are visible are the things that disperse. And those are the particulars in our physical world. However, things that are invisible to the naked eye are the things in themselves, and they don't disperse. And so now we look at the human being. One part of ourselves is the body, another part is the soul. And so they have to decide to which class of existence do we say each belongs. The body, to which is the body more alike and akin to the visible, as anyone can see. What about the soul? Is it visible or invisible? And Phoebe says that it is not visible to men. And so the soul then they put in the category of things that do not disperse. Before I leave this first doubt, I do want to give you this one definition of wisdom. Very beautiful definition. He says, when the soul investigates by itself, it passes into the realm of the pure and everlasting and immortal and changeless. And being of a kindred nature to those things in the second column, things that don't disperse, being of a kindred nature, when it is once independent and free from interference, it consorts with it always and strays no longer, but it remains in that realm of the absolute, constant, and invariable through contact with beings of a similar nature. And this condition of the soul we call wisdom. Now you may notice here that for this one quote, I'm using the translator Hugh Trednick instead of Georges Grube. And I chose this because of just one word, condition. Their translations are very similar, except for this one word. Grube used the word experience. However, if you saw my video on the 4 virtues, one thing I harped on over and over in that video is that the virtues, including wisdom, are not experiences. They are conditions of the soul. They manifest as states of mind. And so wisdom is a condition of the soul, a state of mind. Okay, going on to the second doubt. This doubt can be summarized with this analogy. The body's relationship to the soul is analogous to the lyre's relationship to harmony. And Simmias summarizes it this way. If someone breaks the lyre, cuts or breaks the strings, and then insists, using the same argument as you, Socrates, that the harmony must still exist and is not destroyed because it would be impossible for the lyre and the strings, which are mortal, still to exist when the strings are broken, and for the harmony, which is akin and of the same nature as the divine and immortal, to be destroyed before that which is mortal. He would say that the harmony itself still must exist, and that the wood and the strings must rot before the harmony can suffer. So this is based on the idea of things that disperse versus things that don't. And he's saying if the lyre goes into things that disperse and the harmony is things that don't, then this is what would follow. Socrates, though, says this analogy of harmony to the soul doesn't quite work. He says a harmony is not like that of which you compare it. The lyre and the strings and the notes, though still unharmonized, exist. The harmony is composed last of all and is the first to be destroyed. So very different from the soul. He then gives this other argument. Will it not, if it is more and more fully harmonized, be more and more fully a harmony? And if it is less and less fully harmonized, it will be less and less fully a harmony? Certainly. Can this be true about the soul, that one soul is more and more fully a soul than another, or is less and less fully a soul, even to the smallest extent? He says, not in any way. So souls can be and more healthy or unhealthy, but it's still a soul, the same. And then he asks, what will someone who holds the theory that the soul is a harmony say that those things are which reside in the soul? That is virtue and wickedness. Are these some other harmony and disharmony? So can you have disharmony inside a harmony? If you can have unhealthiness or wickedness within a soul, and harmony is analogous to soul, then you're saying you can have disharmony within harmony. And so it starts to get a little nutty. It seemed like a good theory on the surface. It seemed like it was going to catch Socrates, but when you open it up, you realize the analogy doesn't quite hold. And Socrates goes on, but rather, Simmias, according to correct reasoning, no soul, if it is a harmony, will have any share of wickedness. For harmony is surely altogether this very thing, harmony. It would never share in disharmony. It certainly would not. Nor would a soul, being altogether this very thing, soul, share in wickedness. How could it, in view of what has been said? So by this logic, if a soul is harmony, it cannot have within it anything unhealthy, or what he calls wickedness here. But that doesn't follow. So that argument didn't hold. And then Socrates gives one more point. If the soul were a harmony, it would never be out of tune with the stress and relaxation and the striking of the strings or anything else done to its composing elements, but it would follow and never direct them. And so the harmony follows the physical in the case of an instrument. However, not so with the soul. Further, of all the parts of a man, can you mention any other part that rules him than his soul, especially if it's a wise soul? I cannot. So that didn't work. Now I bring up here Harmonia and Cadmus, because what we've seen throughout is that there's some mythos that Socrates is opening up with his logos. So now we have to look at the mythos of Harmonia and Cadmus and see why this is affecting our two interlocutors here, Simmias and Cebes. They are both from Thebes, and Harmonia and Cadmus were very important to the local religions of Thebes. Harmonia she's a goddess, and she's said to be the daughter of Aphrodite and Ares. So she is a harmony, as her name implies, of beauty and war. Now here's a quote from the text here. After going through all of this, Socrates says, Harmonia of Thebes seems somehow reasonably propitious to us. How and by what argument, my dear Cebes, can we propitiate Cadmus? So Socrates is mentioning these two, so bringing into it that a recognition by Plato that he's implying for us to know, yes, his readers, of course, in the time he wrote, would have known these stories, and so they would see how this mythology may have worked into Simmias's thinking, that this idea of harmony as a blending of war and beauty, and a blending of things, of opposites, if you will, and that represents the soul, and so that worked into Simmias's thinking. As for the liar, that also is part of this myth. Here's a quote from a book I used last week as well on Greek myths by Robert Graves. He shows us that at the wedding, Aphrodite, the mother of Harmonia, presented her daughter Harmonia with the famous golden necklace made by Hephaestus, which conferred irresistible beauty on its wearer. And Athena gave her a golden robe, which similarly conferred divine dignity on its wearer, and also a set of flutes. And then we see that Hermes gave her a lyre. Now, lyre was the instrument that was most closely associated with Harmonia. And so this idea of harmony as the soul and her lyre as the instrument associated with her, you can see how that would work into Simmias's thinking and affect that doubt that he had. Now, as for Cadmus, this was Cebes. Cebes's doubt is rooted in the mythology around Cadmus. Cadmus was a human who married Harmonia, and he's the founder of Thebes, according to mythology. He was closely associated with snakes and serpents, and the snake became a symbol in Thebes of the reincarnating soul, because a snake sheds many skins in one lifetime. And so just as the soul sheds many bodies, the snake sheds many skins. And there are many references to snakes and serpents in the mythology of Cadmus. Here's just one quote that I pulled out. Ares, the father of Harmonia, she rescued Cadmus and Harmonia, and there's a story and we don't need to look at now, that's for another day. But he turned them into serpents, and then they would live happily for all time in the Isles of the Blessed. So the Isles of the Blessed, you may recall, is something akin to the Christian notion of heaven. And so these two went to heaven, even though Harmonia is a goddess. I'm not sure how that worked out, but she went to heaven and she was turned into a serpent. So again, the image of the serpent is the soul. They shed their body and became serpents. And so you can see how this mythology would work into somebody's thinking about the reincarnating soul. And we will see that in Doubt Number 3 by Cebes. And it can basically be summarized with this analogy. The soul is to the body as a tailor is to his coat. So a tailor can make many coats in one lifetime, change many coats, but still eventually the tailor is going to die. Much as the snake can shed many skins, but eventually the snake is going to die. But here's a nice summary that Socrates gave us. To prove that the soul is strong, that it is divine, that it existed before we were born as men, all this, you say, does not show the soul to be immortal, but only long-lasting. That it existed for a very long time before, that it knew much and acted much, makes it no more immortal because of that. Indeed, its very entering into a human body was the beginning of its destruction, like a disease. So that's a summary of the position. Socrates was making sure that he understood Cebes' position so that he could address it accurately. This is not Socrates' idea, this is Cebes' idea. Well, Socrates paused for a long time. He was deep in thought. And then he said, "This is no unimportant problem that you raise, Cebes, for it requires a thorough investigation of the cause of generation and destruction. I will, if you wish, give you an account of my experience in these matters. Then, if something I say seems useful to you, make use of it to persuade us of your position." Okay, so here is how Socrates starts his story. He says, "When I was a young man, I was wonderfully keen on that wisdom which they call natural science, for I thought it splendid to know the causes of everything, why it comes to be, why it perishes, and why it exists." After trying various avenues, he comes across the books of a philosopher named Anaxagoras, who had lived previous to Socrates. He says, "One day I heard someone reading, as he said, from a book of Anaxagoras, and saying that it is mind that directs and is the cause of everything." Well, when Socrates heard this, he was very interested. He said, if one wished to know the cause of each thing, why it comes to be, or perishes, or exists, one had to find what was the best way for it to be, or to be acted upon, or to act. On these premises, then, it befitted a man to investigate only about this and other things what is best. The same man must inevitably also know what is worst, for that is part of the same knowledge. So he's looking at intelligibility as the cause of things. And he eagerly acquired all of Anaxagoras' books. He read them as quickly as he could, hoping to understand this intelligibility that is the cause of all. But his hope was dashed. As he went on reading, he saw that the man made no use of mind, nor gave it any responsibility for the management of things. Instead, he mentioned as causes air and ether and water and many other strange things. So Socrates is not very impressed with people who look to the physical world to understand cause. He likens that to saying that the reason that he was in this jail awaiting execution is because of his bones and sinews and other body parts. And he quickly knocks that argument down. He says, "For by the dog, I think these sinews and bones could long ago have been in Megara or among the Boeotians. taken there by my belief as to the best course, if I had not thought it more right and honorable to endure, whatever penalty the city ordered, rather than escape and run away. And then he laments, imagine not being able to distinguish the real cause from that without which the cause would not be able to act as a cause. So Socrates was dubious of anyone who looked for physical causes. These are, for him, the conditions that allow a cause to function as a cause. The true causes are beyond the physical realm. And he says of these people looking for physical causes, he says they believe that they will sometime discover a stronger and more immortal atlas to hold everything together more. And they do not believe that the truly good in binding binds and holds them together. Now, this idea, I think a lot of people just pass it right by because it's very hard to understand what he's saying here. All right, so there's something beyond the physical. Okay, we get that. Basic metaphysics, if you're just thinking about metaphysics as a theory, it's easy to just follow the theory. But if you want to really experience it, understand it, see the world in this way, this is a meditation, this sentence right here. Because what does it mean that the truly good is what holds things together? That the first cause of all is the truly good. This is a meditation, this idea ties into the idea of mind and intelligibility. So it's a difficult concept, one that we have to sit with and maybe just hold on to. It's not something you're necessarily going to just see it and then immediately, boom, oh, I get it now. It's something we hold on to, put it on the back burner and hold it. All right, so Socrates didn't find any philosopher who really opened up the ideas that he wanted them to, so he decided he had to find his own answers. But he says, I feared that my soul would be altogether blinded if I looked at things with my eyes and tried to grasp them with each of my senses. So I thought I must take refuge in discussions, and I must investigate the truth of things by means of words. And so here is how he did it. He says, I started in this manner. Taking as my hypothesis in each case the theory that seemed to me the most compelling, I would consider as true about cause and everything else, whatever agreed with this, and as untrue, whatever did not agree. So this is basically his dialectic. I did talk about dialectic in more detail in a different video, one on the Phaedrus. Briefly, what I'll say here is dialectic is basically he takes some idea, beauty, goodness, whatever it is, and then he holds as a hypothesis that this is true and that it's functioning in the world. And then he sees what follows. And you just follow the logic, considering everything true that follows, and then see where you end up. And then either you accept it or you say, something is wrong, I got to go back, I made a mistake somewhere. So that's dialectic. And then he said, I assume the existence of a beautiful, itself by itself, a good, a great, and all the rest. So these are the absolute realities, or what academia calls forms or ideas. And then this was the conclusion he brings it to. Consider then whether you share my opinion as to what follows. For I think that if there is anything beautiful besides the beautiful itself, it is beautiful for no other reason than that it shares in the beautiful. And I say so with everything. So he's not interested in the aesthetic quality of the form of the shape, the colors. What he is looking at is that it shares or it participates, or another translation says it commingles in some way with the beautiful itself. Now, Socrates clarifies here that what he's talking about now is different from the argument he gave earlier about opposites giving rise to one another. In that case, that was an opposite thing came from an opposite thing, two things in the physical realm. But now we say that the opposite itself could never become opposite to itself, neither that in us nor in nature. So when you're talking about the absolute realities, you have to think about them a different way. You can have some, say, of dough, like you're making bread. You can stretch it. So it was short and now it's longer. So the longer came from the shorter. It also becomes thinner, so the thinner came from the fatter. But when you're dealing with things in themselves, short itself never has any long in it. They are distinct. So it's a different way of thinking. You have to shift your way of thinking when you're talking about the absolute realities. Okay, here's another argument he gives. Consider the number 3. Do you not think that it must always be called both by its own name, 3, and by that of the odd, which is not the same as 3? And then again, 2 and 4 and the whole other column of numbers, each of them, while not being the same as the even, is always even. Look now. What I want to make clear is this. Not only do those opposites not admit each other, but this is also true of those things which, while not being opposite to each other, yet always contain the opposites. And it seems that these do not admit that form which is opposite to that form which is in them. When it approaches them, they either perish or give way. Shall we not say 3 will either perish or undergo anything before, while remaining 3, it becomes even? Certainly, right? So 3 will never become even. Yet surely 2 is not the opposite of 3. Indeed, it is not. It is then not only opposite forms that do not admit each other's approach, but also some other things that do not admit the onset of opposites. Very true. So the soul will never admit the opposite of that which it brings along, as we agree from what has been said? Most certainly. Very well. What do we call that which does not admit death? The deathless. Now the soul does not admit death? No. So the soul is deathless? It is. And if the deathless is also indestructible, it is impossible for the soul to be destroyed when death comes upon it. For it follows from what has been said that it will not admit death or be dead, just as 3, we said, will not be even, nor will the odd, nor will fire be cold, nor the heat that is in the fire. And so now, if we agree that the deathless is indestructible, the soul, besides being deathless, is indestructible. Then when death comes to a man, the mortal part of him dies, it seems, but the deathless part goes away safe and indestructible, yielding the place to death. Nice imagery, I think. And that's where he wraps up his discussion of the doubts. But one thing I do want to point out is that throughout the dialogue, his friends keep expressing some sense of hesitation or doubt. It's one thing to follow the arguments, to see the logic of them. Quite another for this to be your own state of mind. That's a very different level. And to make that shift, we have to keep working with these ideas. We have to sit with them, contemplate them, meditate on them. And so this idea is scattered throughout the dialogue. Now, this quote, Socrates is talking to Phaedo. Phaedo is our narrator for the story. However, he was not one of the interlocutors. He has only a very small part where he interacts with Socrates, and that's where this quote comes from. Socrates says to him, "It would be pitiable when there is a true and reliable argument, and one that can be understood, if a man who has dealt with such arguments as appear at one time true, another time untrue, should not blame himself or his own lack of skill, but because of his distress, in the end gladly shift the blame away from himself to the arguments, and spend the rest of his life hating and reviling reasonable discussion, and so be deprived of truth and knowledge of reality." And this goes on. This then is the first thing we should guard against. We should not allow our minds the conviction that argumentation has nothing sound about it. Much rather, we should believe that it is we who are not yet sound, and that we must take courage and be eager to attain soundness, you and the others for the sake of your whole life still to come, and I for the sake of death itself. I'm going to give you one other example of a time when Socrates addressed these sorts of hesitations. Simmias at one point says, Certainly, I myself have no remaining grounds for doubt after what has been said. Nevertheless, in view of the importance of our subject and my low opinion of human weakness, I am bound still to have some private misgivings about what we have said. And Socrates replies, "You are quite right to say this, Simmias. But our first hypotheses require clearer examination, even though we find them convincing. And if you analyze them adequately, you will, I think, follow the argument as far as a man can. And if the conclusion is clear, you will look no further. That is true." And so that brings us to the end of this dialogue. If you have any questions or comments, as always, I invite you to leave them below or drop me an email. Also, I would appreciate a thumbs up and you share with your friends. And also, if you don't already subscribe, I do hope that you will, because I try to put out a new video every week or so. From next week, I'm going to go on to the Republic. And this is a longer dialogue. It's broken up into 10, we call 10 books, but it's like 10 chapters. And so I'm going to try to do a video or two on each of those chapters or books. And so next week, we're going to get into the introduction, looking at book 1. So thank you very much. I do hope you'll join me.